Tonight, as you settle beneath your warm blanket and the gentle hush of sleep begins to creep in, let us journey back to a time when winter was more than a season. It was a test of endurance. Picture yourself in a modest, smoky one-room cottage on the edge of a medieval village. Outside, the wind bites like a wolf, howling through the bared trees and creeping through every crack and cranny in your wattle and daub walls. There's no central heating, no insulated windows, and no hot tea steeping quietly on the bedside table. Packed, cold dirt that turned to mud with the melt of snow off your boots. A mattress, if you were lucky enough to have one, was a large sack filled with straw or rushes, perhaps laid atop a wooden frame. Perhaps not. The straw had to be changed regularly. Rats and insects found it just as cozy as humans did. Lice and fleas were constant winter companions, even more so when washing became impossible in freezing weather. You might sprinkle reeds or straw over it to keep your feet dry, but this was no remedy for the biting chill that crept upward from the ground. Most households might have only one or two to go around. Clothing doubled as bedding. You didn't undress for sleep. You layered up, kept your shoes near your feet, and pulled your hood tight over your head. In the deep of winter, darkness might stretch for 15 hours or more. Some historians believe that people in the Middle Ages practiced what is called segmented sleep, two separate phases of rest, divided by a quiet hour or two in the middle of the night. During this wakeful period, you might pray, stoke the fire, check on the animals, or simply lie still, listening to the wind. With no electric lights, candles made from tallow were expensive and burned quickly. Most peasants spent their evenings in near darkness, speaking in hushed tones, telling stories, mending clothes, or praying. But one can't help but wonder, how did they mentally endure it? How did they cope with night after night of bitter cold, knowing spring was months away? The darkness was all-encompassing and quiet except for the creak of wood, the rustle of straw, and the occasional cough or snore. Children slept close to their parents. Siblings cuddled together, all huddled for warmth like animals in a burrow. The entire interior of the home retained the cold, like a sponge retains water. Respiratory infections, hypothermia, chilblains, and trench foot were all risks of winter living. And yet, people survived. They developed customs and strategies passed down through generations. Drying herbs for medicinal tea, insulating windows with animal skins, and sharing warmth as a communal survival tactic. There is, however, a deep, stubborn will to survive. It cooked your meals, provided a bit of light, and offered the only real warmth. But it wasn't always burning. Wood was precious hard to gather in snowy conditions and expensive if bought. Some villages enforced forest laws that restricted who could collect firewood and from where, especially on the lands of local lords. If you were caught gathering deadfall without permission, the consequences could be brutal. Fines, flogging, or worse. Let's begin with the basics. The structure itself. The average peasant dwelling was not built for comfort. The family would gather around it, trying to soak up enough heat to carry them through the long, frigid night. If done properly, a tiny breath of flame could be coaxed from the embers the next day. If not well, then you were stuck with numb fingers in the unpleasant task of starting it anew, perhaps even begging a neighbor for a coal to relight it. Smoke curled up to a hole in the roof chimneys were a luxury most peasants didn't have. That meant the cottage was often filled with smoke, stinging the eyes and coating the walls in soot. And yet, that smoke had a hidden benefit. It helped preserve the thatch, keeping pests away and slowing rot. It was often a single room, shared with your family, parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even the livestock. When fresh, the smell wasn't pleasant, but in time it faded, and the hardened mixture offered just enough of a barrier to keep out the worst of the cold. Still, wind whistled through the gaps, especially in winter, when the material cracked, and the roof, thatch bundles of straw laid thickly enough to repel rain. Though snow had a habit of piling up, pressing down, and occasionally leaking through. Yes, the animals weren't just valuable for food and farming, they were heaters on especially cold nights. It wasn't unusual to find the family goat or cow bedded down right inside the house, emitting just enough warmth to make a difference in a place. Without insulation, the body heat of a few sheep could mean the difference between frostbite and just another chilly night. The walls were usually made of wattle and daub a lattice of wooden strips coated in a sticky mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. Now imagine the floor. Not wood, not tile, not stone, just earth. Sleeping arrangements were equally rudimentary. Most peasants didn't have real beds. Blankets were typically wool, scratchy, and coarse. And then there was the fire. The hearth, set against the central wall or in the middle of the room, was the lifeblood of the household. As a result, the fire was often lit only in the evenings, to keep the fire smoldering until morning. Coals were banked under a layer of ash. As for the nights themselves, they were long, far longer than we're accustomed to today. Sleep was different, too. And there were other dangers, too. Cold could kill. Yezba, so could illness. Over time, even in the harshest of climates, medieval peasants created rhythms and rituals that brought order and a sense of comfort to winter-esque chaos. If you've ever wrapped yourself in a thick woolen blanket and still felt the chill creeping into your bones, then you already know what a medieval peasant lived with daily. But the hearth crude, it was the absolute center of warmth, family, and hope. There was no such thing as fast fashion, and wool was the peasants' most reliable armor against the elements. Some people even slept in their hoods, and rightly so. Medieval hoods sometimes extended to include shoulder coverage or a small cape, essentially creating a primitive thermal seal around the upper body. Gloves were rare, but mittens, sometimes fashioned from scraps of felted wool, were more common in colder regions. Everyone knew to stay close to the hearth, but not just for warm, drying clothing. Baking, flatbreads, or warming stones also took place there. Instead, families learned to cook slowly with soups and stews that could sit and simmer over coals. Bread ovens, for those lucky enough to have them, would retain heat long after baking and could be used to dry clothes, keep infants warm, or simply serve as a warm seat. Stones, once heated near the fire, could be wrapped in cloth and tucked under bedding to create a primitive hot water bottle. In some poorer households, it wasn't just the cow and goat that shared your sleeping space. Pigs were kept inside as a sort of organic furnace. If someone forgot to close the door properly, the wind would creep in like a thief. Parents stayed up later to make sure the embers were well banked. Children learned early to keep still and silent under the covers to conserve warmth. When their toes were numb, their breath fogged in front of their faces, and dawn felt a lifetime away. What was it that got them through? Waking in the night was common, teeth chattering, limbs stiff, noses numb. But you didn't complain. There was no alternative. Their body heat was astonishing, and their grunting noises were surprisingly comforting. But for the average peasant, a heated rock or a tightly huddled family was the only way through. These were not pampered lives. Comfort was not expected. Warmth was not guaranteed. And yet people endured, generation after generation, adapting in quiet, humble ways. Prayer also played a role. Some believed that suffering through cold nights was a spiritual test, or even a form of penance. Others told tales of winter spirits, frost demons, or ghostly visitors who punished those who didn't show gratitude for their modest blessings. Dogs, cats, and chickens might also be brought in for the night. You didn't name them. They were food or labor. But for a few freezing months, there were heated bricks were placed under benches, in cribs, or at the foot of sleeping pallets. Some villages held winter vigils, feast nights, or shared fire rituals during the longest, darkest months. Communal baking was also a thing instead of wasting wood. Villages would share ovens and take turns. These routines brought not only warmth, but also a sense of psychological strength, a reminder that no one suffered alone. Even small things like heated spoons or metal plates could be clutched for a moment's warmth, spun from sheep's fleece and woven at home or by local craftsmen. Wool garments were often thick, heavy, and layered. Your average villager wore multiple tunics, a linen shirt underneath, and heavy outer garments, known as cloaks or mantles. Roofs were thick with thatch, which, while prone to pests, acted as an insulator. Some cottages even had double thatch layers, separated by a few inches of dead airspace that trapped warmth. These cloaks were often fastened at the shoulder or neck with simple pins or ties, and could double as bedding at night. It was common for an entire family, parents, children, sometimes even grandparents, aunts, sleep together in one large bed or bundled pile. Modesty was secondary to warmth. Body heat, after all, is a powerful thing. In some regions, the bed was boxed in, a box bed or closed bed, often tucked into a wall, alcove, or closed off with wooden shutters to keep warmth from escaping. Some had small steps to climb into, and inside it was dark, warm, and still like a cocoon. As you lean closer to it, you'll start to notice the quiet genius of how people fought the cold, not with technology. On top of this, old sacks or patched sheets might be laid down. Some even slept between the petticoats of older family members, tucked beneath like piglets under a sack. But with a patchwork of practical rituals, layered clothing, clever construction, and communal habits refined over centuries. Let's begin with clothing, the peasant's first line of defense. One of the cleverest methods peasants used to stay warm was draft-proofing. Today, we seal our windows with caulk and install thermal curtains. In a medieval hut, window panes were either non-existent or made from greased parchment stretched over wooden frames. To cut drafts, people hung animal hides, woolen cloths, or straw mats over doorways and windows. Some families even stacked bundles of straw along the base of the walls and doors, a rustic insulation barrier to block out the biting wind. The hood or coif for men and wimple for women was essential. Covering the head retained critical body heat. Shoes, too, had to evolve to survive winter. Leather boots, when available, were lined with fur or straw. But in many villages, peasants went barefoot, even in cold months indoors, at least saving their only pair of boots for going outside, if they had any at all. Socks weren't elastic and snug like ours. They were thick wrappings of wool, bound in layers, and secured with strips of cloth. The peasants didn't dress for elegance. They dressed for survival. And survival sometimes meant thinking like a fox, making the most of what you had. Inside, heat zones were well understood, even if not formally studied. The hearth fire itself was rarely used at full blaze. Fuel was too precious. The design of the home also mattered more than you might think. Although crude, peasant cottages often had low ceilings to trap heat. And then there was the bed, or more precisely, the communal sleeping strategy. Another trick was layering the bed itself. The bottom layer was typically straw or rushes, cheap and readily available, though they had to be replaced often to avoid vermin. And speaking of pigs, they, too, were warmth. Then there were the community customs, subtle and clever, that helped everyone share the burden of winter. And still, the nights were long. If the fire burned too low, it would go dark. In wealthier households, warming pans, flat metal pans filled with coals might be used to preheat the bed. Through it all, there's one thing that stands out: resilience. Still, one must wonder, how did these people keep their spirits alive? If the previous nights have shown us anything, it is this: medieval peasants didn't merely endure the cold, they turned it into something communal, something cultural, something more than just a struggle for survival. And here, in this final part of our winter journey, we enter into the strange, rich, and occasionally joyful world of ritual, festivity, and frostborn folklore, the social salves that helped people get through the darkest season of the year. In Scandinavian regions, the Yule log wasn't just a cozy fire feature, it was a spiritual safeguard. Children left shoes out in hopes of receiving nuts, apples, or small breads. Villagers would gather at the church or village green to observe processions, sometimes accompanied by masked figures, meant to ward off evil. Peasants often waited until these saints' days had passed before planting spring crops. The very mention of their names evoked caution, a reminder of nature's cruel unpredictability. It was a time of moral reflection, yes, but also laughter and cheer. Storytelling, especially during the long evenings, served not only as entertainment but also as oral history. Even the poorest peasant family had melodies simple, repetitive, and warm. Some communities organized rotational firekeeping, where a single hearth was kept alight for others to use. In others, ale or warm cider might be shared in quiet celebration, and disputes were put aside, at least until the spring thaw. Who punished laziness? The Mari Elwyd in Wales, a skeletal horse, to mend in song and ale, and the Krampus, a horned beast who punished misbehaving children. These were not bedtime tales, but communal warnings. Survive, behave, cooperate. In winter, there was little room for selfishness. Winter songs were often sung around the hearth, lullabies, chants, and rounds that invited others to join. Winter was, after all, the season when death came closest. Could we survive winter with nothing but grit? Grit and a little bit of borrowed warmth. Picture also the stubbornness, the inventiveness, and the quiet joy in a warm spoon of broth, a flickering flame, and a shared laugh in the dark. They didn't thrive, but they endured, year after year, winter after winter, and they've passed that knowledge on, not through grand tomes or royal edicts, but through whispers by the fire, fingers wrapped around a warm stone, and the slow, silent courage of cold feet on frozen ground. It was believed that spirits walked more freely in the cold months, and at certain days like the winter solstice thin the veil between the living and the dead. It carved traditions, shaped community ethics, inspired stories, and preserved food. People survived, not only by layering wool and hoarding wool, but by forging bonds, building meaning, and acknowledging the cold, not as an enemy, but as a part of life. People left offerings by doorways, chalked symbols above hearths, and told each other not to whistle after dark. Superstition flourished in winter silence. Snow fell on manors and cottages alike. While the rich had more fuel, thicker clothes, and better insulation, they were not entirely immune. In this season of hardship, small gestures, a shared log, a borrowed cloak, a space near the communal event became acts of generosity that shaped relationships for months to come. They weren't composed for performance. They were sung to survive boredom, to cheer children, and to feel alive in the cold. Elders passed down tales of past winters, of floods and famines, of clever escapes from snowbound roads, of the year when wolves wandered too close to the village. Winter feasts weren't opulent, but they were deeply meaningful. A boiled goose for Christmas, a shared pottage thick with stored beans and salted meat, bread sweetened with a rare handful of dried fruit. These meals were both nourishment and a reminder that joy could still be found, even amid scarcity. These stories weren't thrilling, they were grounding. They connected generations. They taught, warned, and reminded everyone that hardship was part of the human rhythm. A massive log was burned slowly over several days, believed to protect the home and ensure fertility in the year to come. The fire was both literal warmth and symbolic hope. Families shared small gifts, sang songs, and told tales of gods, giants, and snow spirits. These communal moments broke up the monotony of cold and darkness. While winter brought hardship, it also brought a slowing of the agricultural calendar. Fields lay dormant beneath frost and snow. Days were short. The pace of work, while never truly still, shifted indoors, in that liminal space between one harvest and the next. There was time for storytelling. It is no accident that many of the most enduring community festivals in European culture take place in the depths of winter. Yule, for example, has ancient roots, well before it was folded into Christmas traditions. In Catholic regions, the Feast of St. Nicholas, held in early December, brought a welcome break from gloom. The church calendar placed many holy days throughout winter, including Candlemas in early February. a feast marking the return of light. Candles were blessed and carried in procession through the village, symbolizing the slow return of warmth. The practice was both devotional and deeply psychological. In a world without electric light, even a single flame could hold the weight of a promise. There were also the ice saints, Memurtis, and Cervates whose feast days fell in May, but were feared in folklore for their association with late frosts. But perhaps the most unifying winter tradition was the communal gathering and music. It wasn't just for lords and courts. Food, too, played its part not in abundance, but in ritual. Interestingly, winter also brought with it a social recalibration. Class lines blurred slightly when everyone was cold. Lords stayed indoors, just like peasants. Villagers had unwritten rules for how to care for the elderly, the sick, and the widowed during the winter. But it wasn't all kind-hearted simplicity. There were also fears. Children were warned of dark figures that haunted the snow, perched in the Alps. Despite the fear and chill, winter left marks not just on bodies, but on the soul of society. So when you think of medieval peasants in winter, try not to picture only the suffering. And still, one quiet question lingers, like a gust under the doorframe. If stripped of our comforts, could we do the same? Tonight, as the warm water of your bath or shower fades into memory, and you tuck into soft, freshly laundered sheets, it's worth asking a strange, slightly uncomfortable question. What did it really mean to be clean in the Middle Ages? Not just for a king in a perfumed palace, or a monk with a basin of holy water, but for the everyday peasant, trudging through mud, sweat, and centuries of evolving superstition. Running water, as we know it, was non-existent for most medieval Europeans. For the rural poor, water came from a communal village, well, a nearby stream, or a rain barrel tucked under thatch. Medieval people didn't consider daily full-body washing essential or even desirable. Lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat, was caustic and smelled strongly of whatever ingredients were used. Interlousing was a social ritual, one friend or family member slowly combing through another's hair by the firelight. Hair washing might occur monthly or seasonally, depending on access to water and weather. Farm workers came home, filthy from the fields, and might rinse their feet and hands each evening. Women, particularly those managing childbirth or the sick, washed more frequently, especially in monasteries or hospitals. These were indeed the luxurious spas of the Roman Empire, but more humble versions, wooden structures with heated tubs or communal pools. Streams offered the chance to rinse off, wash clothes, and escape the heat. But rivers were also toilets, slaughterhouse, drains, and laundry stations. In medieval times, scent played a different role. People used herbs and perfumes, not to mask foulness as we do, but as spiritual protection. A nosegay of rosemary, a pouch of lavender tucked into your tunic. These weren't just aromatic, they were believed to ward off disease, especially during plague outbreaks. How did they find comfort or pride in their appearance amidst such limitations? Scent, not soap, was often the final word in cleanliness. Washing downstream from a tannery meant scrubbing your skin in water tainted with animal hides and lime. It was rarely refreshing, but it was better than nothing. Outer garments were rarely washed. They were heavy, hard to dry, and time-consuming to clean. Instead, people washed their linen underclothes. More often, these were the filter between the body and the outer world. They absorbed sweat, oils, and dirt. Washing linen in cold weather was grueling work. Scrubbing, boiling, beating against rocks, then drying before the next freeze. But it was one of the few consistent practices in a peasant's hygiene routine. For a small fee, a peasant or laborer might enjoy a warm soak, perhaps once every few weeks or months. Entire families might go together. Men and women sometimes bathed in shiftsur, controversially, together. In some regions, these bathhouses became associated with immoral behavior and were shut down or heavily regulated by the church. Their understanding of cleanliness was different, rooted in availability, survival, and belief rather than medical science. They did what they could with what they had. They innovated, improvised, and persisted. Children were often ignored in hygiene matters unless they developed visible skin conditions, rashes, scabs, or boils. Herbs like rosemary, lavender, or nettle were steeped in water to rinse the scalp, believed to keep lice at bay and leave a fresher scent. It stripped the skin of oils and could leave hands raw. Peasants might use a crude form of it on, especially dirty days after harvest, perhaps, or during slaughter season, but not often. More common was sopwort, a wild plant with mild cleansing properties, boiled into a gentle, foamy solution. While today we know that unclean conditions can breed bacteria, medieval people saw disease as more moral or mystical. Bad air, imbalance of bodily humors, or divine punishment were more common explanations for illness. Washing wasn't always thought of as protective. It was sometimes discouraged, especially in winter, under the belief that bathing opened the pores and made one more vulnerable to cold or evil influences. It was used to wash both bodies and garments, though its effectiveness was limited. Instead, they practiced what historians now call dry bathing, rubbing the body down with cloths, brushing off dirt with powders, or changing linen undergarments frequently to absorb sweat and oils. Linen, it was believed, cleansed the skin by drawing out impurities. Toothbrushes didn't exist, but people used chew stick twigs from certain trees, like hazel or birch reed, at the end to form a brush-like edge. They scrubbed with these, or rubbed teeth with salt, ashes, or powdered mint. Mouthwash might involve rinsing with vinegar or wine. While cavities and gum disease were common, outright toothlessness was less so than you might expect, thanks, in part, to a diet low in refined sugar. As such, the wealthy might change undergarments daily, even if they rarely bathed. For the poor, changing clothes weekly was more realistic if they owned more than one set at all, and fetching it was no small task. It required time, strength, and repetition. In winter, the well might freeze. In summer, the stream might dry. The simple act of collecting water was laborious, limiting how often it could be used for bathing. Let's step into that world slowly because, frankly, it didn't smell very nice. Start with the obvious. Water. Now, picture the bath itself. There were no gleaming porcelain tubs, no scented soaps, and no soft white towels. Bathing, for most, involved little more than a wooden or tin base set near the hearth for warmth and a bucket of cold or lukewarm water. Heated water was a luxury, requiring valuable firewood and careful supervision. A full-body wash was rare. A quick rinse of the face, hands, and feet was more typical. Some families took turns using the same bathwater, eldest to youngest. Infants were usually last. The idea of cleanliness varied wildly from what we understand today. Hair was another matter entirely. Lice, nits, and fleas were nearly universal. Combs made of bone or wood were valuable tools. And what about teeth? The medieval smile gets a bad rap, but it wasn't always as horrific as popular culture suggests. Still, personal hygiene was often dictated more by season, gender, and occupation than by habit. Speaking of which, disease and dirt were not always seen as connected. Nevertheless, public bathhouses did exist, especially in towns. But for the rural poor, the closest they might come to bathing culture was a dip in the river during summer. There's also the matter of smell, something we take for granted today. Clothing, too, did some of the work. Despite everything, it is a mistake to think of medieval peasants as filthy in the way we use the term today. And yet, we must ask if full-body bathing was rare, lice were everywhere, and soap was a harsh luxury. How did people maintain dignity? Now that we've appeared into the peasantess' wooden wash basin and rinsed our hands with soapwood and cold well water, let us take a few careful steps towards something grander, though not necessarily cleaner. There were social hubs, gossip centers, matchmaking arenas, medical outposts, and sometimes the modern mines. These places might evoke images of Roman style, but the reality was far simpler and often a bit grimmer than romanticized murals would suggest. Let us enter the communal bath. Not every town had one, but where they existed, bathhouses served as more than a place to scrub away the grime. In a few towns, steam rooms existed, heated by stoves and filled with vapor created by splashing water onto hot stones, like a crude sauna. For instance, in late medieval Paris, ordinances tried to enforce more decent conduct in warning against inappropriate touching or shared bathing between unmarried individuals. Others had attendants who helped heat the water, offered towels, or even scrubbed the backs of clients. In wealthier districts, bathhouse workers might offer massages, haircuts, beard trimming, or even basic medical treatment like the lancing of boils or the pulling of infected teeth. In many urban bathhouses, male and female clients mingled freely. Some facilities employed women who offered companionship in more ways than just pouring water. The term stew became slang not only for bathhouse, but also for brothel, and it wasn't always clear where one ended and the other began. Reformers saw them as emblematic of moral decay. Clergy denounced the naked mingling of men and women. During plague outbreaks, bathhouses were closed, not just for moral reasons, but also due to fears that water and steam could spread disease. Even though bathing was sometimes encouraged by doctors for cleanliness, the church's position fluctuated, sometimes condemning public nudity, other times promoting cleanliness as godliness. Church officials began railing against bathhouses as dens of sin, or because we feared what it could not wash away. Monks followed rules that prescribed regular hand washing, foot bathing, and occasional full immersion. Some abbeys had bathhouses for the monks and guests. However, even here, the ritual often took precedence over the hygienic. The bath was for humility, not comfort. Municipal records from cities like London, Nuremberg, and Florence show waves of crackdowns, closures, and attempts at regulation. Should the body be exposed to God's creation or hidden away under layers of wool? For peasants, washing remained a private, piecemeal affair. A yearly or seasonal bath might be enough. Washing your face each morning was more common, done with a cloth soaked in water from a ceramic pitcher. Hair might be rinsed monthly. Children were spot cleaned when they became too filthy to ignore. Dirt was part of life, and no one expected to be spotless. Unsurprisingly, these warnings were not always heeded, not just for health, but for warmth, for connection, for comfort. The bathhouse wasn't just a tub of water. It was one of the few places in medieval life where your social burdens might feel briefly lighter. You could sink into hot water, let go of the day's labor, and pretend, if only for a moment, that the world was cleaner than it truly was. They were technically tolerated under the oversight of local lords, so long as certain rules were followed, such as not allowing married men to enter or forbidding mistreatment of the women employed there. But these rules were inconsistently enforced, and the stew houses lingered in a legal and moral gray zone for decades. On the one hand, there were places of cleanliness and health. On the other, they were increasingly associated with sexual immorality. Men and women might bathe in separate rooms or on different days, but records show that mixed bathing was surprisingly common during parts of the 12th and 13th centuries. In some places, this was accepted. In others, it sparked moral panic. In the early medieval period, especially across parts of Germany, France, and the Low Countries, bathhouses were common in cities and growing towns. Their popularity likely stemmed from Roman influence, as public bathing was deeply ingrained in Roman urban life. For peasants, this was a luxury, so bathhouses were often frequented by the urban working classes: blacksmiths, butchers, weavers, and the payment gave you access to a room with one or more large wooden tubs, sometimes filled with hot water, other times lukewarm, depending on the hour and the fire's strength. Water wasn't always changed between you got in after someone else and hoped they weren't covered in open sores or lice. There were no drains, no chlorination, no regulation, just water, fire, and whatever the last person brought with them. As Roman bath complexes crumbled across Europe, Simpler local versions re-emerged in the Middle Ages, not quite marble fountains and mosaics, but timber rooms with heated water, smoke-darkened walls, and the unmistakable scent of boiled herbs and sweat. Let's walk in gently. First, you'd pay a small fee. In some cases, customers shared a tub, especially families. Others took turns. Bathers were typically nude, though some wore linen loincloths or towels. Modesty standards varied across time and place. For all their simplicity, these bathhouses weren't without amenities. Some served light food and drink, usually mulled wine or spiced ale. But here is where things begin to blur. By the 14th century, especially after the devastation of the Black Death, bathhouses began acquiring a dual reputation. This wasn't entirely unfounded. In London, by the late 1400s, the bathhouses, known as the Stews of Southwark, were explicitly linked to prostitution. In other cities, bathhouses became political issues. It is worth noting, though, that in monastic settings, bathing retained a more positive image. Outside cities, the communal bathhouse was far rarer. Despite this, there's something remarkable about the persistence of bathing culture. Even when it was controversial or logistically difficult, people wanted to bathe. They enjoyed it. Still, the contradictions of medieval bathing remained unresolved. Was cleanliness holy or dangerous? Did water purify the soul or invite temptation? And as the bathhouse fell out of favor in some regions closed due to plague fears, moral crackdowns, or fire risk, one must ask, did we abandon the bath because we feared what it revealed? As the steam rises from the last bathhouse door we've just left behind, it's time to step into the deeper waters of belief, medicine, and fear, the true shaping forces behind medieval hygiene. For in the Middle Ages, washing your body was never just about being clean. It was about your soul, your station, your relationship with illness, and in time, it was about what you feared might happen if you washed too much. For many orders, such as the Benedictines' rules, governed everything from sleep to prayer to washing. Cleanliness was part of spiritual discipline. They were expected to wash their hands and feet regularly, especially before meals or prayer. Bathe in the whole body, however, was more limited, once a month or during specific holy festivals. Bathhouses existed within many monasteries, with water piped in from nearby springs or aqueducts. These weren't luxurious, but they were orderly and functional. Let us begin not in a city or a peasant's hut, but in the cloistered halls of a monastery. In the 16th and 17th centuries, during later plague outbreaks, city leaders closed baths, fearing that heat and humidity would spread sickness. People stopped washing as a preventative measure. Dirt, once a nuisance, became oddly comforting. Monks lived by strict routines. Monks also bathed the sick and the poor, offering basic hygiene as an act of charity. Herbal baths especially, using rosemary, sage, chamomile, and nettle, remained popular among healers and midwives. These herbs were boiled in water, strained, and poured into basins for sponge bathing or foot soaks. These weren't just for hygiene. They were rituals of healing and protection. Using soap could be seen as vain, something the idle rich did, while the honest poor wore their dirt with pride. In sermons and plays, clean characters were often mocked as foolish or effeminate. Dirt, oddly enough, became a kind of virtue, a sign you worked hard, didn't concern yourself with worldly appearances, and trusted in God's protection rather than soap. Mothers would wash newborns with warmed milk and lavender. Old women bathed the dying in holy water. In many places, it was for clothes, not body. Contact with the Islamic world through trade and conquest reintroduced forgotten Greco-Roman medical texts. Scholars began debating humors, diet, and hygiene with fresh interests. Physicians began to recommend moderate bathing again. Not too often, not too hot, and always in good air. The rise of university medicine helped, but its benefits were slow to reach the villages. Washing laundry was grueling labor. Boiling linens in cauldrons with soap, lye, or urine, scrubbing them against boards or rocks, and hanging them to dry in the sun. Nobles built private baths, Midwives kept herbal wash mixtures on hand for birth and rituals. Yet for peasants in the fields, not much changed. Water was still scarce, soap still harsh, and winter still cold. Women did this work communally, near rivers or in village washhouses. It was social, ritualistic, and exhausting, but it wasn't always connected to personal cleanliness. A world in which hygiene was practical, spiritual, and symbolic all at once. A place where soap could be salvation or sin, where a bath could be a celebration or a risk. You could have freshly scrubbed linen and still be covered in mud. Washing had become a ceremonial and act of transition between life stages. In monastic infirmaries, patients were washed with herbal infusions, and their sores were cleaned with vinegar or wine. You might visit one not just for a haircut or bloodletting, but for a scalp wash, an ear cleaning, or a tooth pull. These professionals walked the line between hygiene and medicine. Their tools were rudimentary, their success inconsistent, but they helped preserve some form of bodily care through the chaos. Though monks lacked modern germ theory, they often noticed patterns. Wounds fared better when washed, and infections spread less when cloths were cleaned. These quiet observations created pockets of relatively advanced hygiene in a world that largely viewed dirt as normal, and animal fat used for laundry, and harder soaps, like the famous Aleppo or Castile soap, made with olive oil and lye. These hard soaps were imported, expensive, and used sparingly. Nobles and merchants might keep scented soap in their chests. The poor rarely saw it, but outside the cloisters, plague would change everything. The Black Death, which arrived in Europe in 1347, was more than a health crisis. It was a cultural earthquake, as the death toll soared. Some estimate a third of Europe perished. Theories about its cause. There was a growing belief that being too clean made you vulnerable. Many people stopped bathing altogether, even if they could afford it. The very act of removing dirt might, in their eyes, strip away a protective barrier. In some places, physicians advised sealing windows, avoiding water, and wearing perfumed pouches around the neck. Water, once a symbol of cleansing, became a perceived conduit for death. Some blamed bad air, others foreign traders, and others sin itself. Amid this hysteria, bathing became suspect. Doctors and clerics began warning that bathing could open the skin's pores, letting the poisoned air of the plague seep in. This fear lingered for centuries. The association between water and disease remained long after the Black Death waned. And yet, not everyone gave up on cleanliness. In the countryside, some traditional practices endured. In towns, barber surgeons filled the gap left by closed baths. But now we must turn to something strange: soap itself. Soap has existed in various forms since ancient Babylon. In the Middle Ages, two broad types circulated. Soft soap, made from wood ash soap, wasn't always associated with bathing. Even more curious was the social divide around soap use. Still, slowly, things began to shift. By the late Middle Ages and into the early Renaissance, new ideas about the body emerged. By the 1500s, in cities like Florence and Paris, perfumed soaps and scented oils became symbols of refinement. So, where does that leave us? With a culture that was never quite filthy, never truly clean, and perhaps most of all, with a question: if cleanliness is next to godliness, why did so many believe dirt could keep the devil at bay? Tonight, before you drift into sleep, imagine reaching for your evening meal, only to find ... Nothing. No bread, no grain, no milk or meat. Just a gnawing emptiness and the quiet dread of not knowing when or if food will come. Up to 75% of their daily calories came from grain, barley, rye, oats, and, when they could get it, wheat. This was baked into coarse loaves, boiled into porridge, or soaked in pottage. Bread was more than food. It was a daily ritual, a symbol of God's provision. In the Latin Mass, it was the body of Christ. To go without bread, then, was not merely to be hungry, it was to be unmoored from the rhythm of life itself. In the modern world, true famine feels far away, a distant shadow in history books. But for the medieval peasant, it was never far. In the absence of grain, peasants turned to famine foods. Bark bread made from the inner bark of pine or birch was ground into a flour-like pulp, mixed with straw or moss, and baked into bitter cakes. Starving families roamed the countryside, begging, stealing, and foraging in already empty woods. In the chaos, people began to question the foundations of their society. Had they angered God? Were the lords hoarding grain? Was the end near? Cities became overwhelmed by refugees. Some turned them away. Others taxed the population to provide relief bread. In France and England, chroniclers wrote of children sold into servitude, old people voluntarily starving so the young might eat, and parents leaving infants at monasteries in hopes of mercy. Crops that year were meager. Recovery was slow. Some regions required 5 years to return to pre-famine yields. Entire villages were depopulated. Fields lie fallow. Family lines ended. These were barely digestible. They filled the stomach, but gave little nutrition. After centuries of expansion, the Great Famine reminded everyone that survival was not guaranteed. Others began to rotate crops more carefully, returning to older methods to preserve soil health. A single hailstorm, a lord's war, or a locust swarm could spark it. And so they developed a deep culture of thrift, of preserving, stretching, and substituting. Recipes were born not of pleasure, but of endurance. Bread crusts were saved. Bones were boiled twice. Weeds became in some areas, communal ovens and mills were established to reduce the dependence on individual food stores. Rural monasteries developed more sophisticated charity systems, distributing grain in lean years. A sense of fragility had entered the European mind, but also resilience. Faith was shaken. Traditional explanations faltered. Nature had turned against them, and there was no prayer, no relic, no indulgence strong enough to stop it. Nettle soup, acorns, oiled weeds, and wild roots all made appearances. Some dug up animal feed. Others chewed leather. Cats and dogs disappeared. Rats became a delicacy. Many became landless laborers, selling their strength in exchange for scraps of food. Children were sometimes adopted into other households, though in truth, it was a form of indenture. By late August, the grain heads are thin, the barley patchy. Then, just before harvest, a sudden frost, what was already marginal, becomes catastrophic. Some were stored communally in barns or under the Lord's control. In better years, surpluses might be salted, smoked, dried, or buried in pits. Villages shared what they had. Churches opened their stores. Lords reduced rents or forgave debts. In others, breakdown occurred. Riots, grain theft, and local uprisings spread. Grain merchants were especially vulnerable, often blamed for hoarding. In a few cities, they were publicly executed after show trials. But peasants didn't have much surplus. By early winter, many families were already stretched thin. Porridge grew thinner, loaves smaller. Children were fed less. Meat was unthinkable. Salted fish, beans, and turnips took its place when they were available. It waited in the wings of every bad harvest, every unexpected frost, every war, and every blight. And when it arrived, it did not knock. It simply entered. Let's begin at the most basic level. The medieval diet. For peasants, bread was life. Quite literally. Now, picture this. A year of strange weather. Spring rains come late. Crops are planted to shallow. Summer is too dry. This was no fantasy. This was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. One of the worst food crises in European medieval history. After years of population growth, marginal farming, and expanding into poor quality lands, Europe reached its agricultural ceiling. And then came the rains. It rained in spring, summer, and autumn. Crops rotted in fields. Hay could not be harvested. Livestock, without feed, began to starve. People followed soon after. Famine crept slowly at first. The grain reserves, if a village had them, were limited. And then came the terrible moment. The pantry went empty. What followed was a slow, grinding ordeal of substitution and compromise. And still, the rains fell. By the second year of the Great Famine, the situation worsened. Disease followed naturally. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Dirty water, tainted food, and overcrowded shelters invited dysentery and typhoid. The social consequences of famine were not uniform. In some places, community structures held. The famine also widened existing inequalities. Wealthier peasants or yeomen might survive by selling livestock or tools. The poorest had no such assets. By 1317, the rains finally eased, but the land was exhausted, and the psychological impact was just as lasting. Chroniclers speak of a shift in mood across Europe, from optimism to caution, and yet people went on. New strategies emerged. Some villages built granaries for the first time in centuries. Still, hunger never vanished. Every peasant knew that famine was always possible, and even then, the question always loomed. When would the next one come? When would the grain vanish again? And what would we become in its absence? Now that we've emptied the pantry and watched the last sack of barley slip through calloused fingers, let's look more closely at what came next. Not just the despair, but the desperate creativity. Because medieval people, when faced with nothing, still found something. In this chapter, we enter the kitchens of famine-humble hearths, where hunger cooked up the unthinkable, and out of bark of trees like birch, pine, elm, or ash. Bark bread was barely digestible, often bitter and rough on the stomach, but it filled the belly. Some families mixed in sawdust or straw chaff to stretch the yield even further. In the worst years, it was bark bread or nothing. Roasted acorns, when leached of tannins, were ground into a bitter meal. In good years, meat was rare, but attainable pork, lamb, or fowl. In famine, everything with a pulse became a target. Hedgehogs, badgers, cats, rats, squirrels, and songbirds all ended up on the spit. Frogs were skewered and roasted. Insects and grubs were crushed into pastes. Birds' nests were raided for eggs. Some people boiled them in ash water to neutralize. Dried peas, if they could be found, were ground and pressed into cakes. Communities still shared meals. Poor as they were, families gathered around the fire, spooning watery broth from the same pot. Monasteries handed out thin gruel, cooked by novices and nuns. The meals were bland, repetitive, and humiliating, but also life-saving. Before meals, prayers were still said. Bread, no matter how strange its ingredients, was still blessed, and mush appeared with increasing frequency in records during hard years. So did dough recipes for mock versions of real foods. Mock cheese, mock meat, and mock kale, even to loosen add value. Candles were lit, grace was whispered. Hunger gnawed at the body, but the soul clung to something older. People offered what little they had. Half a turnip, a pinch of salt, a crust of bark bread to the old woman next door, or the family who lost their cow. Moss scraped from rocks, boiled and strained, became a kind of famine jelly. Wild mushrooms, some of them dangerous, were eaten without certainty. When your traditions become substitutions, your meals become experiments, and your dignity is eaten one bite at a time. How do you still sit down to supper and call it home? Children grew up remembering how to make bark flour, how to spot edible lichen, how to soak acorns until they didn't burn your mouth. These became generational tools, passed down as insurance against the next famine. Even the concept of cannibalism, while horrifying, surfaces in scattered chronicles. Even in good years, people stored the past in root cellars and memories alike. They salted more, dried more, hoarded more. They watched the weather with suspicious eyes. They measured winter not by days, but by how many sacks of grain they had left. Some accounts, likely exaggerated or metaphorical, speak of desperate parents and black stews made of unthinkable ingredients. These stories were often used to illustrate moral collapse, not necessarily real event, but they reflect just how deeply famine struck at the heart of social and ethical order. Peasants stripped trees bare, carefully shaving away the bitter outer bark, then peeling and drying the cambium. Children were sent to forests and fields to dig for roots, gather snails, or pick wild herbs. In some regions, bog moss and seaweed were coastal peasants chewed dried kelp. Inland villagers trapped birds with crude snares made of thread of vines. People ate horse feed, even if it was moldy. They ground up spoiled rye, praying it wouldn't lead to ergot poisoning, which caused hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. Once dried, it was ground or pounded into a fibrous, grayish flour. Ash. Water lye made from hardwood ash was used to soak grains, soften bark, or disinfect food. While dangerous if misused, it could also act as a crude preservative. It left an acrid aftertaste, but taste was no longer the point. Let's begin with one of the strangest but most widespread products of famine. No, this wasn't a poetic nickname. Bark bread was quite literally made from tree barks, the soft inner layer called the cambium, found between the wood. These were known in various regions as and in times of famine, they became grotesque symphonies of substitution. A good famine pottage might include foraged greens like nettles, chickweed, sorrel, or fat hen, boiled with water, salt, and old bones often reused multiple times to leach out the last bit of flavor. Bits of moldy bread, turnip skins, onion peels, or fermented cabbage might be added. The resulting substance, if mixed with a handful of grain, flour, water, and perhaps some salt or ashes, could be kneaded into a dough and baked into dense, chewy loaves. Then came the soups and stews, which stretched whatever meager ingredients were available into something resembling a meal. Bone broth became essential. In wealthier times, bones were given to dogs or discarded, but in famine nothing was wasted. Bones from cattle, sheep, pigs, or anything that had died were cleaned, cracked open, and boiled for hours to create a greasy, vaguely meaty liquid. The broth might then be thickened with barley husks, acorn flour, or even crushed snail shells. If a family had no meat or bones, they might boil old leather boots, belts, or harnesses, softening it into a gelatinous slurry. Sometimes the meals weren't even hot. In truly desperate moments, peasants turned to raw or near-raw substitutes. Then there were animal substitutes. The line between survival and taboo became blurry. Hunger doesn't honor culinary rules. Church fast days, once followed with discipline, were ignored when starvation loomed. And then there was foraging, the daily, exhausting task of finding food where no one thought it existed. In desperation, even ashes found a place in the kitchen. Food became fuel, nothing more. But alongside these grim recipes, there existed strange forms of comfort. Charity was often religious in tone. Churches gave out alms loaves, when they could, coarse barley bread stamped with a cross. And even within famine, ritual persisted. Interestingly, famine even affected food language. Words like pottage, brose, gruel, and when the hunger lifted, when a real harvest returned, people didn't forget. Recipes were preserved in folk memory, yet the hunger never left entirely. And so one wonders if survival means eating whatever the world offers, even when the world offers almost nothing. Then how much of your identity changes? So far, we've crouched beside the hearth, stirred bark-laced porridge, and foraged for moss. But famine is never just about food. It's also about power. Who holds it, who hoards it, and who starves because of it. In this final chapter, we step beyond the kitchen and into the village green, the manor hall, and the city streets. But more often than not, famine was exacerbated, if not entirely caused by human systems. Feudal rents, grain hoarding, corrupt toll collectors, war taxes, and absentee landlords. The medieval economy was precarious, and even a small disruption could send an entire region tumbling into starvation. Because when stomachs growl long enough, they begin to speak, and sometimes they scream. In many regions, Peasants were required to sell their grain to local lords first, or to store it in communal barns overseen by manor officials. Others were accused, sometimes rightly, of hoarding, waiting for prices to spike before releasing their stores. Survivors became bandaged snot out of wickedness, but desperation. The line between peasant and outlaw blurred. In most cases, bread, not revenge, not power, just bread. Records show small, coordinated attacks on grain convoys, manor storehouses, and river bar. These weren't criminal gangs in the modern sense. They were starving farmers, organized and angry, in towns. These merchants were frequently the targets of riots, especially when bread prices rose beyond what laborers could afford. Failure to act could spark rebellion. In Florence, Bruges, Ghent, and London, city councils prepared for unrest with armed guards, rationing systems, and bread subsidies. Bakers were often ordered to produce black bread, low-grade loaves, made from mixed grains, and brand and sell them at fixed prices. Women married earlier or later, depending on local conditions. Widows begged at church doors. Friendships frayed under the weight of hunger. Old debts were forgiven or ruthlessly enforced, and yet, in many places, famine also birthed moments of startling generosity. A neighbor charige, a lord forgiving the season's rent, a church offering bread every seventh day. These moments did not erase the suffering, but they shaped the story peasants told about themselves, that they endured, and sometimes that they endured together. A wedding might feature a loaf made from ground acorns and dried berries. A bad harvest year might be called the year of no bread. A dead tree near the village square might be the one where bark was peeled for loaves. It taught caution, frugality, and above all, community strategy. Because survival wasn't just about having enough. It was about knowing when to share, when to ration, and when to speak out. Children might be told, "Eat your bread your grandmother once ate much." A feast day might include a pasty filled with mashed roots instead of meat. These weren't celebrations in the traditional sense. They were rituals of resistance, proof that culture could survive even when cuisine could not. Nobles could buy imported grain, slaughter surplus livestock, or retreat to lands that had fared better. For them, famine was mostly an issue of managing peasant unrest, not actual hunger. They issued edicts, made gestures of mercy, and sometimes hosted charitable feasts. But the lived experience of famine belonged almost entirely to the lower classes, the ones who took, threshed, baked, and starved. Those caught price gouging were punished publicly. In one case indeed, a baker who cheated on his weights was dragged through the streets with a moldy loaf tied around his neck. Recipes born in famine seasons were passed down for generations, sometimes as staples, sometimes as warnings. In parts of Scandinavia, bark bread was still made ceremonially in the 18th century. In Ireland, stirabout became a symbol of both poverty and persistence. In Eastern Europe, fermented cabbage, soup cooked with scraps and bones, became both comfort food and famine fare. In 1316, during the worst of the Great Famine, King Edward II of England was criticized not only for failing to respond quickly, but also for spending lavishly on tournaments while his people starved. Chroniclers speak of discontent brewing like sour ale, of villages refusing to pay rents, and of bands of starving men roaming the countryside in search of grain, justice, or both. Bakeries were looted, scales were smashed, shops were torched. In many places, it wasn't uncommon for local officials to enforce price controls or seize grain outright under the banner of public justice. Even if a peasant had enough to feed their family through winter, they might be forced to surrender it to meet their feudal obligations. This grain was then stored, traded, or sold for profit. In bad years, lords might raise prices, tighten access, or simply export the grain to wealthier cities. Let's begin with a simple truth. In the Middle Ages, famine was often man-made. Sure, the rain could fall too hard, crops could fail, cattle could die. Take grain, for example. Meanwhile, grain merchants operated in an equally unstable market. Some were honest traders who tried to stretch supplies, and this wasn't just local. Famine became political theater. Kings and nobles were expected to provide relief during hard years, whether through grain shipments, reduced taxes, or temporary hunting rights. In France, the situation was worse. Entire regions fell into chaos. Some villages were abandoned altogether, their fields reclaimed by weeds. And what did they want? In urban centers, hunger riots became seasonal events. But food, even in famine, remained symbolic. Peasants still tried to maintain their traditions, even when ingredients were missing. Some of these improvised dishes became part of regional memory. But not everyone remembered equally. In noble households, famine was a distant thundercloud. Yes, but rarely close enough to dampen the velvet cushions. And famine didn't just affect food, it rewrote social bonds. In hard times, entire families were broken. Children were lent out to other households for food and work. And after the hunger passed, because eventually, it always did, people remember. Not in books or royal decrees, but in stories, songs, and warnings. Famine left scars, but it also left wisdom. It taught people to dry beans more carefully, to store turnips in straw, to plant hedges that grew edible berries, and to build ovens that could bake with less wood. And as we finish this story, and you rest in a world where food is close, and bread is no longer sacred by scarcity, ask yourself this: what would your kitchen look like if the grain stopped growing? What would you cook, and who would you trust when hunger knocked on your door? Tonight, as the world quiets and your eyelids grow heavy, let us gently drift into the slower rhythms of the past. Not the clash of armor or the roar of battle, but something much softer, more enduring. Picture a village, still cloaked in shadow. Before the sun has dared to rise, the chill of dawn clings to the thatched rooftops. The roosters have yet to crow, and yet, behind thick wooden doors and beneath low cottage beams, a quiet world is already in motion. This is the world of women's work. Embers were stirred in the hearth. Dough was kneaded with practiced palms. A pail was fetched, and water was drawn from the well. Livestock stirred in the cold. Children needed tending. A thin porridge simmered on the fire, not the sort found in royal chronicles or carved into stone, but the kind sewn into the fabric of daily life. Women would twist wool with their fingers, letting the spindle dangle, pulling the fibers into thread. A horizontal loom might stretch across a peasant home, the weaver seated low, arms moving in a steady rhythm. But still, it was women wives, daughters, maids who worked the fibers, often gathering together in shared spaces to spin and gossip. Weaving both fabric and friendship, the shuttle darted back and forth, and the beater pressed each strand firmly. Back and forth, back and forth. Hours, days, weeks to produce a single bolt of cloth. This wasn't just a task, it was a constant companion. Dresses were sewn, tunics were patched, hose were darned. No scrap was wasted. Garments were passed down, resized, layered, and a good piece of clothing might last a decade or more before finally ending up as a rag, a diaper, or a wrapping cloth. Garments were scrubbed raw on wooden boards or stones, beaten with paddles, then rinsed again and again. Eyes stung, fingers bled, backs ached, and yet no scrolls praised a woman hunched over a spinning wheel. Midwives, wise with experience, attended births with calm and courage. Their hands delivered life. They knew how to ease pain, bind wounds, soothe fevers. Some were revered. Her spindle, smoothed by years of use, passed to her daughter. A piece of her embroidery might line a cradle or a coffin. Her hands, though now at rest, had touched every inch of that home. Others, in darker centuries, were accused of sorcery, but in their own time, they were the village healers. No ballads sang of the one whose hands were stained blue from woe dye, but these hands kept the world turning. There was laughter too, stories shared, recipes swapped. These washing spaces were also social ones where women came together to connect, to vent, to simply be, one not marked by bells or war horns, but by sunrises and moon phases, by hunger and harvest, by the flicker of a candle or the scent of baking bread. Spindles hung from belts, nestled in aprons, and were kept spinning even as women walked or spoke. Children learned it young. Spinning was not something you stopped to do. Wove through your day, as natural as breathing. Nothing could be wasted. Every task had its hour. Timing was everything. Milk would sour if left too long. Herbs lost potency after the dew vanished. Children cried. Firewood burned low. The soup thickened, and through it all, the women moved. Quiet, efficient, tireless. Washing clothes in the medieval period wasn't a daily or even weekly task. It was seasonal, done only when the weather, the water, and the women aligned. Quiet, rhythmic, often invisible but utterly essential. In the humble home of a medieval peasant, the day for a woman began long before first light. Brewing was a daily science, measured by warmth, grain, and time. Barley or oats, flavored with bitter herbs like yarrow or wild horehound, are simmered in kettles. It wasn't just a drink, it was safer than most water, and a good brewer could earn extra coin, trading jars of ale for bread or cloth. And yet, beyond these daily chores, another rhythm pulsed, one older than memory, one carried from mother to daughter. The care and creation of fabric, nearly every part of the process, from raw fleece to finished cloth, passed through a woman's hands. Textile work was not a hobby or a pastime, it was survival. Let's start with spinning. Before the arrival of the spinning wheel, there was the drop spindala, simple rod, weighted and elegant in its purpose. From spindle to loom. Once the thread was ready, it had to be woven. In grander homes, materials changed. Ruffle gave way to linen made from flax, or to silks imported from distant lands. The word distaff, the tool holding raw fibers, became synonymous with womanhood. That tells you how central this labor was to a woman's identity. And when the cloth was woven, it was time to sew. Every single garment in the medieval world was hand. Not one came off a line or out of a shop. And then there was laundry. In our modern world, it's a chore. Back then, it was an ordeal. Linen was soaked in caustic lye, sometimes made from ashes and urine. Beyond the wash, there was butter to churn, ale to brew, herbs to dry. Ale was often the domain of women. There were also cheeses to age, meats to cure, vegetables to pickle, and grains to grind. Much of this labor was never written down. Even childbirth, a sacred and dangerous frontier, belonged to women. All of this spinning, stitching, scrubbing, and when a woman passed on, her work often remained. So as we lie back now, listening to the imagined hush of a loom-mesh shuttle or the bubbling of ale in a warm pot, let this thought linger. If these hands wove the very fabric of life, why did history so often forget to mention them? If you listen closely enough to the village soundstock clang of metal, the bleating of goats, the murmurs of prayer, you'll hear something softer underneath. The bubble of fermentation, the breath of a woman in labor, the whispers of midwives gathered in candlelight. These are the sounds of women's work, too, not the visible kind, but the sustaining, cyclical kind. Ale wasn't just a drink, it was a staple. Water could be unreliable, often contaminated, especially in towns. Ale, with its boiling process and alcohol content, was far safer. Even children drank it. This was not the heavy beer of taverns, but small ale, light, mildly alcoholic, and packed with calories. It was poured at weddings, sipped after childbirth, and offered at wakes. And every tankard carried the quiet mark of the woman who stirred the mash and watched it foam. Most women bore children many times in their lives. 5, 7, or even 10 births were not unusual, but not all survived. Maternal mortality was high. Infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labor, all were constant threats. There were no hospitals, no sterile instruments, and no anesthesia. Yet into this peril came the midwife. Some herbs eased pain, others stimulated contractions. A few were used to end unwanted pregnancies, though such use was cloaked in silence, secrecy, and moral ambiguity. Knowledge was power and danger. Work that brewed life, healed wounds, and caught children into the world with steady hands. The midwife, or local wise woman, provided postnatal care, checking, bleeding, helping the baby nurse, applying compressors to torn skin, and bathing mother and child. They made poultices for wounds, syrups for coughs, and salves for cracked skin. Garlic, honey, vinegar, and wine were staples in their medicinal kit. They bled patients with leeches, set broken bones with wooden splints, and applied hot stones to aching joints. While male physicians wrote Latin treatises, women healed with their hands. If the baby died, as many did, she offered comfort, spiritual reassurance, and arranged for burial. If the mother died, she closed her eyes and dressed her in clean linen. But she had knowledge passed down through practice, observation, and memory. Witchcraft accusations often targeted midwives, wise women, or herbalists, especially those who operated outside the church's control. Their labor was as constant as the tide, as vital as breath. No man fought a war, built a barn, or preached a sermon without first being brought into the world by a woman's hands. And when he died, it was her hands again that closed his eyes. A woman who knew too much, cured too many, or failed to save the wrong child could find herself condemned. Midwives were sometimes blamed for difficult births, stillborn babies, or sterility. A generation earlier, they were praised. Now, they were feared. The laboring woman was supported by midwives, mothers, aunts, and neighbors. Death, like birth, was domestic, intimate, handled quietly by the same women who had midwifed the beginnings of life. They rubbed her back with warmed oil, whispered prayers, and sang hymns. She might grasp a birth stool, a braided rope, or the edge of the bed. The light was dim, the air was thick, but in rural areas, most midwives were unlicensed, informal, and deeply trusted by their communities. And it's worth noting many of them outperformed male doctors, who often arrived late, ill-prepared, or too focused on theory to help a real laboring body. And through it all, the midwife stood steady. She learned from mothers, grandmothers, and other midwives. She knew how to measure the swell of a belly, how to position the baby with her hands. On the other, their independence, especially over matters of life and death, made some clerics uneasy. Midwives were expected to ensure that a baby in danger of dying was baptized. If not, they might be blamed for the infant's soul being lost. And how to cut the cord with a sterilized blade, often boiled in ale, or passed through flame. Grain, usually barley or oats, was soaked, mashed, boiled, and fermented. Yeast was not fully understood but cultivated, nonetheless sometimes carried on wooden paddles, reused repeatedly as lucky brewing tools. Herbs like groot, mugwort, or yarrow added flavor. Before hops became common, let's begin with brewing, an art and science entrusted for centuries to women. In medieval Europe, before brewing became a professional, male-dominated trade, women brewed the daily ale that nourished their families and neighbors. Women brewed in the kitchen, near the hearth, in large cauldrons that doubled for cooking. The brewster was often responsible for multiple batches per week, depending on the household size. And if her ale was good, she might sell extra to neighbors or at the local market. For some women, brewing became a modest business, where they hung a broomstick or ale stake outside the door to signal fresh brew. But success attracted scrutiny. If a woman brewed too much, charged too high a price, or received too much attention, she could be fined or worse, accused of cheating customers or of suspicious activity. Still, ale flowed through the veins of medieval life, and women brewed it. Now step into another world entirely. The birthing chamber. Childbirth was as common as sunrise and nearly as dangerous. The medieval midwife was not a doctor. She had no formal schooling, no parchment certificate. The birthing room was a women-only space. Men husbands, priests, even doctors were rarely present. Midwives knew herbal remedies to They brewed teas from raspberry leaves, motherwort, pennyroyal, or rue. The church alternated between tolerating and mistrusting midwives. On the one hand, they were essential. In towns, some midwives were licensed by bishops. These women swore oaths to uphold church doctrine and not to use magic or charms. Then came the healing work after birth. Beyond birth, many women were responsible for basic medical care in their households. And when they failed, when someone died, the same women often prepared the body for burial, washing it, dressing it, and wrapping it in cloth. But with knowledge came risk. By the late medieval period, suspicion of women's healing practices began to grow, and yet women continued their work. They brewed, they birthed, they buried him. But still, the question remains. If women delivered nearly every life and mended nearly every wound, why were their names so rarely written down? We've spent time by the hearth, where ale simmered in the quiet tension of the birthing chamber, and beside the loom where thread became cloth. But as we turn now to the legacy of this work, we find something strange. Silence. Not in the labor itself, which never ceased, but in the records, in the chronicles, in the stories passed on to us by time. In the medieval world, reading and writing were largely confined to the church, the nobility, and the growing class of urban merchants. Most women, especially in rural areas, were illiterate, not by lack of intelligence, but by design. Education was not made accessible to them. Monastic schools, cathedral grammar schools, and universities excluded girls. A woman might brew and sell ale for 40 years in a town, yet only appear in the record books once when fined for overcharging or summoned to answer for an unlicensed stall. Folk tales, ballads, and oral histories did include women, but not as laborers. Instead, they were cast as wives, witches, mothers, or saints. In marginalia, they appear as comic figures or warnings images of nagging wives, alewives with foaming jugs, or haggard midwives. These caricatures tell us that women's work was seen, but not respected. Rarely was the spinner or the midwife the hero. The work itself was invisible. The labor behind the lace simply assumed, never admired. In Flanders and northern Italy, women were part of weaving guilds and worked as dyers, spinners, and tailors. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, wrote extensively on natural medicine, childbirth, and healing herbs. But her work was preserved because she cloaked it in divine inspiration, visions, and piety. They remembered how to brew ale with dried ivy, how to cure cloth with buttermilk, how to comfort a dying child. Their knowledge lived not in books, but in baskets, gardens, and cradles. The line between healer and herot, between wise woman and witch, blurred dangerously. Physicians copied herbal remedies they had learned from nuns. Brewers used techniques long developed in kitchens. Midwifery manuals began appearing, written by men describing procedures women had performed for centuries. The midwife who saved 20 babies might be praised until the 21st died. The herbalist who cured a merchant's cough might be rewarded until the merchant's wife miscarried. Then came the whispering, the unease, the accusations. By examining household inventories, manorial rolls, wills, and court records, they are piecing together the hidden economy of women's labor. The unnamed wife who saved seed from the best squash, the grandmother who remembered how to spin when the wheel broke, the girl who became a midwife after watching her aunt catch babies during a harsh winter. We now know that women in medieval towns sold eggs, butter, ale, cloth, candles, herbs, and bread, that they managed complex domestic economies, balanced debts, and made decisions that shaped family survival. But even here, their participation was often restricted. They could work, but not lead. They could contribute, but not represent. A widow might be allowed to inherit her husband's workshop, but she was expected to remarry quickly so that a man could resume control. If a woman learned to read, it was often through a convent or more, rarely through the household tutoring of a wealthy father. Medieval women worked endlessly, and yet they are barely visible in the histories that survive. The field, the council, the pulpit, the battlefield. These were places where men acted. The home, the garden, the sickbed, the laundry. These were where women lived. And history, as it was told then, celebrated only one of those spheres. Let us begin where history often does, with the written word. Even noble women who might read religious texts or manage estate records rarely wrote for public life. As a result, the chroniclers of history were overwhelmingly male. Monks, scribes, court historians, and early scientists shaped the medieval narrative, and their focus was rarely on what they considered women's work. The loom, the cradle, the brew kettle. These were not the subjects of epics or annals. This erasure wasn't malicious, it was cultural. Medieval society divided the world into public and private, and women's labor was confined to the latter. Even legal documents, which might have recorded female economic activity, often neglected women unless they were widows or property holders. And what about storytelling? Still, some evidence remains fragments of a fuller picture. In illuminated manuscripts, we sometimes glimpse women at work, crouched over tending sheep, brewing in cauldrons, and preparing food. In guild records, women occasionally appear as members, especially in textiles. In church hagiographies, women healers were sometimes sanctified, but only if they framed their work as religious devotion. Then there were the accusations. When women's knowledge became too visible, too powerful, or too independent, it sometimes attracted suspicion. And yet, despite all this, the work continued. Women trained their daughters. They passed down recipes, techniques, and wisdom through spoken word, through gestures, and through practice. Some of this knowledge seeped into the male world, though rarely with credit. And so, slowly, women's knowledge became everyone's knowledge, but their names were left behind. Today, historians are digging deeper. We are also learning to read between the lines, to hear women's voices, not only in what is written, but in what is absent. They're not always clearly, not always loudly, but they're. And so, tonight, as the last spindle slows and the cooking fire turns to embers, we ask, how many of history's quietest workers never made it into the records? Not because they didn't matter, but because they mattered too quietly. Tonight, let us lace up a pair of worn leather shoes, if we're lucky enough to have any end step outside the village boundary. It's dawn, the ground is damp, the wind is low, and we have a journey ahead, not across continents or empires, but a few miles down the road to the next market, or perhaps to a nearby monastery. In our time, it would be an errand, barely worth mentioning, but for a medieval peasant, this was a rare undertaking, requiring planning, stamina, and more patience than you might expect, because in the Middle Ages, travel was slow. Even the most important roads were narrow, uneven, and unpredictable. They might fork suddenly without signage. They twisted to follow land features, skirting forests, winding through marshes, and hugging ridges. Bridges were rare, often no more than planks lashed together, and fords could flood without warning. Wolves weren't common, but in hard winters, packs might emerge. Strangers were a threat, too. A lone traveler without proper papers or affiliation could be accused of trespassing, stealing, or simply being suspicious. Monks, nobles, and messengers carried letters of protection. Peasants had only their reputation, if anyone along the road happened to know it. Painfully, deliberately slow, especially if you were poor. But there were reasons to venture out. A seasonal market or fair might draw families from neighboring villages. A young man might walk 20 miles to a nearby town in hopes of earning wages as a day laborer. Otherwise, you might ask for lodging at a church, huddle in a stable, or sleep beneath hedgerows, using your cloak as a blanket. They walked to marriages, to funerals, and to festivals. Pilgrims journeyed hundreds of miles on foot, enduring swollen feet and hunger in hopes of touching a relic or reaching a holy city. Trade routes emerged moody, winding, and vital. News passed from village to village. Languages evolved. Dialects spread. Songs migrated in winter. This was dangerous and sometimes deadly. A skilled spinner or carpenter might bring goods to a larger market. It was associated with transformation. The road led away from home but also toward identity. A youth who left as a shepherd might return as a soldier. A woman who went to care for an ill aunt might come back with tales of saints and markets and songs never heard before. Others traveled by obligation to deliver rents, attend court, or serve military duty under their lord. The road was forgotten until next time. Did the slowness itself make the destination matter more? These gatherings offered a chance to sell surplus goods, buy salt or cloth, or hear news from afar. There were also holy sites and shrines, which even poor pilgrims hoped to visit at least once, whether to seek healing, forgiveness, or simply escape. Let's begin with your feet. Most peasants traveled on foot. Horses, carts, or even donkeys were a luxury few could afford. Leather shoes were precious. Some owned none at all and walked barefoot for much of the year. Rape, assault, or abduction were real threats, especially along the lonelier roads. Most women traveled in groups, accompanied by kin or neighbors. Mothers with children moved slowly, planning rests near church porches, crossroads, shrines, or known farms. Most travelers carried simple provisions: hard bread, dried beans, and salted fish. Water was scooped from streams or drawn from public wells. At larger churches or monasteries, you might be offered a crust and ale for charity's sake. But beggars weren't always welcome, and laws often restricted various directions at crossroads, though dialects could be tricky, and signs were non-existent. Distances weren't measured in miles, but in days. A 5-mile walk could take half a day. A journey of 30 miles might require 2 nights on the road, with nowhere guaranteed to sleep. What passed for a road was often a rutted track, choked with weeds in summer and turned to soup in winter. If it rained, which it often did, your feet sank inches into clay. And if you slipped, there were no clean laundries waiting at the next village. Others wore simple clogs or turn shoes, thin leather soles stitched to flexible uppers, offering little more than token protection from the cold and mud. In Northern Europe, wooden pattens overshoes with raised wooden soles were worn to keep feet dry in deep slop. But they were noisy, cumbersome, and poorly suited to long-distance travel. And so, for most peasants, walking meant numb toes, blistered heels, and caked legs. Roads were not paved. They were barely maintained. Medieval roads had names like the King's Highway or the Pilgrim's Way, but don't be fooled. Travelers had to be resourceful. They followed the grooves worn by They watched for sun markers or notched trees. And the road wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Bandits patrolled isolated stretches, especially near forests or abandoned ruins. So why travel at all? Most peasants stayed within 5 to 10 miles of where they were born their entire lives. Some peasants traveled for work, especially in the off-season. Travel was always a negotiation of risk and need. If you were a woman traveling alone, the dangers multiplied. And what of food? You didn't stop at an inn every 5 miles. Shelter was rarely guaranteed. If you were fortunate, a relative in another village might take you in. Yet, despite all these hardships, people did travel. Slowly, stubbornly. They made their way. Travel made the world larger, even when the steps were small. And in the minds of medieval peasants, the road itself became a place of meaning. Still, after every journey, no matter how long, the rhythm resumed. The fields waited. The cows needed milking. The laundry piled up. But one wonders, in an age when every journey costs blood, sweat, and days of walking, did travel feel more sacred? Let us now follow the road a bit farther, not toward markets or manor courts this time, but towards something deeper, quieter, and more personal. A pilgrimage, because for many medieval peasants, the only true reason to leave the comforts of village life and brave mud, wolves, and hostile strangers was a journey made in hope or repentance, a journey made for the soul. And so tonight, picture yourself walking slowly, deliberately toward a holy shrine. Perhaps it's a nearby site, like the tomb of a local saint, or perhaps it's farther, Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, even Rome or Jerusalem. Some went in gratitude, others went out of fear of disease, infertility, poor harvests, or war. And sometimes, people were sent on pilgrimage as punishment to sentence given by local lords or ecclesiastical courts. They often walked barefoot or in sandals as a show of humility, resulting in infections, frostbite, and foot rot. Some carried relics or letters of passage, hoping these would shield them spiritually or at least discourage thieves. A man might be ordered to walk barefoot to a distant chapel, carrying a cross, or wearing sackcloth, as penance for theft or adultery. For most peasants, long pilgrimages were aspirational, not achievable. But regional shrines, the kind within a week's walk, were common goals. Townspeople might offer a bit of stew or a place by the hearth in exchange for a blessing or a story. Monasteries offered limited shelter, simple meals, and spiritual counsel. The monastic guest house was often Spartan, a straw mat, a basin of water, perhaps a shared bowl of beans, but it was dry and safe. Why go? Shrines often held relics, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, drops of sacred oil. A priest more interested in collecting coin than offering comfort. Pilgrims were sometimes scammed or treated with suspicion, especially if they looked poor or foreign. And yet, they still made the return journey. Pilgrims knelt before these relics, prayed aloud or in silence, lit candles, and left offerings. Some returned home with pilgrim tokens pinned to their cloaks, a badge to show they had fulfilled their vow. Even if they came back to the same muddy cottage, the same ox cart, the same field, they came back changed. Potholes filled with mud that could snap a cart axle. Potholes of conflicting directions, where signposts were carved away or deliberately altered. Potholes of miscommunication, where dialects diverged so much that travelers could barely understand the locals. Walking wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Every step carried the weight of prayer, exhaustion, superstition, and memory. And the journey wasn't measured in distance, but in suffering. The more difficult the path, the more meaningful the arrival, or the road that wore them down and softened their souls along the way. Pilgrimages were made for many reasons: to atone for sin, to fulfill a vow, to seek healing, or to pray for a miracle. But whether voluntary or forced, pilgrimage required planning. They were said to be haunted by spirits, cursed by witches, or frequented by criminals. Many villagers avoided them after dusk. Crosses were often erected at these junctions to offer protection. It was believed that the souls of the damned wandered crossroads, trapped between destinations. Burials of unbaptized babies, suicides, or executed criminals sometimes occurred at crossroads where no one wanted them in consecrated ground, but where the edge of the world seemed thin enough to hold them. Peasants would prepare by gathering food course, bread, dried peas, salted meat, if they had any. They might wear their second-best tunic, saving their finest for arrival at the shrine. Others required crossing deep forests, exposed moors, or dangerous bridges. Bandits knew these routes well. They preyed not just on the wealthy, but on any traveler who appeared vulnerable. A man limping alone, a woman with no companion. These were easy marks. Some fashioned badges or tokens to signify their intent: scallop shells for Santiago, a palm for Jerusalem, or a simple wooden cross. Many pilgrims carried a staff, a wide-brimmed hat, and a satchel slung across the chest. These were not just symbols, they were survival tools. The roads were not always friendly to pilgrims. Some shrines were along well-trodden routes, supported by hostels, priories, and roadside chapels. Even the elements themselves were a danger. Pilgrims faced snow, rain, and heat. And yet, despite the hardship, many continued walking. Villagers along the way came to recognize and support pilgrims. And at every bend in the road, there was the possibility of a pothole, not just literal, but metaphorical. And then there were crossroads, places of decision, but also places of fear. Crossroads in medieval folklore were mystical and dangerous. For the traveler, this folklore added layers to the journey. And what did pilgrims find at the end? Sometimes healing, a miracle, a vision, or at least a sense of spiritual relief. But other times, the destination was underwhelming. A poorly kept chapel, a crowded queue. Because in truth, the journey mattered as much as the shrine. Pilgrimage offered a rare chance to leave the village, to see new lands, to meet strangers, to experience movement in a world bound by repetition. And for many, pilgrimage was a metaphor for life itself. Hard, uncertain, slow, and full. A stumbles but, and still, one quiet question lingers. Was it the saint at the end that saved them? As we near the end of our long, muddy journey through the world of medieval travel, it's worth pausing not at a shrine or fairground this time, but at a roadside tavern. Not all travel ended in revelation or repentance. Often, it ended in the simple hope of a warm bench, a wooden mug of ale, and a fire that hadn't yet gone out. Because when you've walked 20 miles through puddles and wind, when your cloak smells of wet wool and your soles are caked with clay, the flickering light of a tavern window can feel almost holy. Let's begin there. Taverns, also called alehouses, were ranged in size and quality. Some were little more than a peasant's home with a bench and a cauldron, offering coarse bread, thin broth, and home-brewed ale, and bits of salt pork, black bread with sour cheese, a hard-boiled egg. If you had coin, you might afford a bowl of pottage and a pint of ale. If you had none, perhaps you'd barter a tale for a crust or a small repair in exchange for shelter. And if the tavern was too crowded, you might sleep outside, your back to the wall, wrapped in your cloak, with your pouch clutched beneath you. These weren't always large sums. A few pennies, a piece of fruit, or a portion of bread. If a bridge collapsed underfoot or a wheel broke in a rut, the traveler paid the price literally and physically. But for a poor peasant, every toll was a decision. Some tossed a coin into the river as a humble offering. Others marked a spot in their memory as a place of furor, a place of mercy. Take the short road with a fee, or the longer track through the woods where bandits might lurk. Others, especially in market towns or along major trade routes, were more established, places with stables for animals, shed beds, and perhaps a private corner for wealthier guests. But even the humblest tavern had its own rhythm. Travelers shared space with locals, tradesmen, and sometimes priests or partners. News was traded alongside gossip. A peddler might share rumors from a far-off town. A refugee from a nearby village might be met not with compassion, but with suspicion. Are you bringing plague? Are you a spy? A thief? A serf? Hoping to escape bondage and find freedom in a charted town? These journeys, though rare and difficult, offered hope. The possibility of a better life, no matter how slim, was enough to pull someone down the road with nothing but a pack and a prayer. A minstrel might sing for supper. The fire was central, warming soaked cloaks, drying blistered feet, and quieting weary limbs. Others were displaced by famine, flood, or plague. It was made of questions. Who had the right to move? Who could afford to stop? And how far could someone go before they stopped being welcome? They moved not out of choice, but because they had no home to return to. These people haunted the margins, camping in woods, begging at shrines, knocking at tavern doors. Their presence, a reminder that movement was sometimes a form of survival, not freedom. Foreigners could be denied entry to towns, barred from markets, or blamed for local misfortunes. A peasant from one region might be considered a stranger just 10 miles away. Perhaps the road shaped not just their feet, but their understanding of community, of borders, of strangers, and of themselves. Food, if offered, was usually simple, a stew of beans, leeks. Yet taverns weren't just rest stops, they were part of the infrastructure of movement, and that infrastructure had rules. To move freely in the medieval world, especially beyond one's home parish, a person often needed permission. Local lords issued travel tokens, letters of passage, or safe conduct documents. They built informal networks, relatives in other towns, fellow guild members, and tavern owners who owed a favor. A weaver might sleep in a dyer's barn. A widow might find shelter with a former neighbor's daughter. Over time, The road became a web of relationships, not just geography. These might be inspected by gatekeepers at city walls, toll collectors, or local officials. Vagrancy laws made it dangerous to wander without a purpose. If you couldn't prove you were traveling to market, pilgrimage, or employment, you risked being fined, whipped, or even imprisoned. And then there were the tolls. Crossing a bridge, entering a town, or passing through a forest stall could require payment. Toll bridges were especially contentious, maintained by lords or local religious houses. They were sometimes in poor condition, rickety planks, missing boards, swaying ropes. Yet the toll remained. Roadside shrines sometimes stood beside these crossings. Travelers would kneel and pray before crossing, asking for safety or strength. And if you were a foreigner, movement was harder still. Accents raised eyebrows. Clothing gave you away. Names were questioned. But even locals weren't immune to the politics of movement. During times of war, plague, or rebellion, roads might be closed entirely. Lords posted guards. Cities locked gates. Notices warned against harboring travelers. And yet, people kept moving. Despite the risks, the weariness, the politics, and the mud-medieval peasants did travel. They learned to navigate the system. It's important to remember, travel wasn't always a burden. It could also be a lifeline. A young woman fleeing an unwanted marriage. And then there were those who traveled without destination. The wandering poor, the landless, the rootless. Some were former soldiers. And so, as we end this slow walk through muddy lanes and crowded inns, it becomes clear the medieval road wasn't just made of dirt and stones. Perhaps the slow pace of medieval travel gave people time to think about such things. And so we ask, one final time in this journey, when you walk a road that does not want you to pass, what part of you must you leave behind to keep moving forward? Tonight, as you let your thoughts slow and settle, picture a small workshop tucked behind a crooked street perhaps, beside a bakery, across from the parish well, or beneath the eaves of a timber-framed guild hall. It's dark inside, save for a single lantern swinging gently from a rafter beam. This is the quiet, unseen world of medieval craftsmen, the tinkerers, the makers, the fixers. And though their work rarely found its way into history books, nothing in the medieval world could function without them. The air smells of wood shavings, damp leather, and cooling iron. No mass-produced nails. Everything was individual. Everything was slow. A man or a boy perhaps sits hunched over a worn bench, in his hand a chisel. Before him, a half-carved wheel spoke, or a dented knife, or a pair of boots needing repair. Craftsmanship was learned by doing again and again. This is not the world of knights and nobles. They carried their tools and a small bundle of clothes. In each town, they hoped to learn a new technique, perfect a skill, or gather enough money and reputation to one day become a master themselves. It would be inspected carefully. Was the grain of the wood aligned? Did the weld hold under pressure? Were the seams tight? If the master approved, the apprentice might graduate to one who journeys, seeking work under different masters. A village boy might be sent to live with a master, often in exchange for a fee paid by the family. He would sleep in the shop, eat with the family, and work from sunrise to after sundown. Life as a journeyman could stretch on for years or a lifetime. For years, he might not be allowed to touch the master's tools, only observe. Slowly, as trust grew, he'd be permitted to assist in minor tasks, stitching a seam, shaping a wooden peg, and filing a rough edge. Pride, stability, identity. In towns, trades were surnames: Smith, Baker, Fletcher, and Carter. In smaller communities, many were self-taught, part-time, or mixed. A man might be a carpenter in summer and a thatcher in winter. A woman might mend clothing and brew ale. Flexibility was survival. You learned whatever the village needed. A man's work became his name and his legacy. Nobles paid little mind to the man who made their armor. Lords dined without thinking of the potter who shaped their plates. Churches commissioned altarpieces, but seldom recorded the woodcarver's name. It might be a carved chair, a silver goblet, or a perfectly balanced sword, but most remained anonymous. Their work functional and invisible. A blacksmith might hammer out the same gate hinge 200 times, and every saddle that held a craftsman's hand had been chiseling, hammering, shaping, checking, and fixing. Their labor was not loud. It did not march in parade. It did not swing swords or write laws, but it built the world those other people walked through. A cordwinner or maker of new shoes cut and stitched identical pairs every day for decades. Their hands developed calluses, their backs bent forward, and their fingers stiffened with age. The guild examined it and voted. If accepted, you were allowed to open your own shop, take apprentices, and stamp your work with a guild mark. This was not a job. It was more like servitude with training. Without the thatcher, no roof over the miller's head. Without the wheelwright, no cart for the harvest. Without the glazier, no light through the chapel windows. Let's begin with the basics. To understand the life of a craftsman, you must understand his tools. Most craftsmen made their own or inherited them from their masters. Blacksmiths forged their own hammers. Carpenters carved their own mallets and bit for boring holes. A fine-toothed saw and chisels he'd carefully sharpened over years. A leather worker used awls, punches, knives, and heavy needles, each worn smooth by long hours in hand. Tools were kept in canvas rolls or wooden boxes, passed down like family heirlooms. A cooper might spend hours fashioning a curved drop knife that only he knew how to use. There were no hardware stores. A woodworker might carry with him a folding ruler made from whalebone. A brace, but tools were only part of the equation. The rest came from apprenticeship. Becoming a craftsman began young, sometimes as early as age 7. The apprentice would sweep floors, carry coal, pump the bellows, fetch water, and prepare materials. There were no shortcuts. By the age of 14 or 15, an apprentice might produce his first independent piece. A simple stool, a pair of sandals, or a horseshoe. Journeymen wandered from town to town, hiring themselves out. And what separated a journeyman from a master? 2 things: a masterpiece and permission from the guild. To join a guild, a collective of craftsmen who controlled trade, prices, quality, and training you needed to present a masterpiece, an original work of exceptional quality. But many never made it. Some lacked the skill. Others couldn't afford the materials. Some simply ran out of time or health. Meanwhile, in the shop, work was rarely glamorous. A carpenter might spend days planing planks for a barn that no one would notice. The work was repetitive, but it mattered. Without the cooper, there were no barrels, no way to store ale or saltfish. And for the craftsman himself, the reward wasn't fame or fortune, but something quieter. But village craftsmen weren't always part of guilds. And still, craftsmen were often underappreciated. There were exceptions. Some stonemasons, goldsmiths, and illuminators gained fame, especially if they worked for a cathedral or royal court. And yet, the medieval world was full of their fingerprints in every latch that closed, every door that swung. And so we ask, as we close this chapter of slow, honest work, what does it mean to leave no name behind, but to leave something behind in every object that lasts? Let's step now from the smoky corners of the solitary workshop into something grander, more organized, more political. As night settles and the village quiets, imagine a heavy wooden door creaking open onto a candlelit chamber. That system was the guild. Inside, benches, long tables, ledgers, and the quiet murmur of men in woolen tunics and leather aprons. They were part union, part brotherhood, and part civic institution. And once you were in, you belonged for better or worse. This is the guild hall, the beating heart of urban craft life in medieval Europe. Because while the countryside craftsman might work alone with no more than a hammer and reputation, the urban artisan lived within a system structured, protective, and strict. There were goldsmiths, carpenters, bakers, weavers, shoemakers, tanners, masons, and tailors' guilds. This was not always a fair process. Sometimes the required fees were too high. Sometimes a master might block a promising rival's admission. If a shoemaker used inferior leather or a baker cut flour with chalk, the guild could fine, suspend, or expel him. They regulated apprenticeships, ensuring a young boy couldn't be overworked or mistreated. They settled disputes between members, sometimes more effectively than local courts. Politics played a role. Guilds weren't just about skill, but connections, family ties, and favors. In large cities like London, Paris, and Florence, the guilds were powerful enough to influence civic law and taxation. In smaller towns, they still held sway over trade, pricing, apprenticeships, and disputes. Some cities allowed female master craftsmen in cloth production, especially in Flanders. But overall, guilds were patriarchal, and entry was tightly controlled. Guilds were associations of craftsmen or merchants formed to regulate trade, control quality, protect members, and defend their economic and political interests. Ethnic tensions, linguistic barriers, and competition for customers made guilds wary of outsiders. One faction might push for stricter quality controls. Another might favor broader membership to increase profits. Petitions were filed, bribes exchanged, accusations whispered in candlelit corners. Not all decisions were about craft, they were about preserving the guild's power. These men organized inspections, enforced standards, collected dues, and sometimes acted as local governors. In cities where guilds were especially powerful, like Florence, they had seats on city councils and influence over laws. Even rural craftsmen who moved to the city might find the guild doors closed unless they could prove exceptional skill or connections. The guilds turned anonymous labor into institutional identity. A barrel was no longer just a barrel lit, was a cooper's guild barrel. A cloak was a tailor's guild cloak. A candlestick bore the mark of the chandler's guild. If he fell ill, it might feed his family. If he died, the guild paid for his funeral and supported his widow. If a noble refused to pay for custom work, the guild could act as enforcer, demanding justice. These were not just fellow tradesmen. They were brothers in trade, and sometimes in faith. Let's start with how it worked. Churches might demand lower prices or labor in exchange for blessings or tax relief. And in a world where work meant survival, how much freedom could any worker truly have? Each major town had dozens of guilds, one for each major trade. To join, as we saw earlier, a journeyman had to complete a masterpiece, submit it to the guild council, and be approved. Funeral processions were arranged, prayers said, and candles lit. In some towns, guilds built almshouses, charitable homes for elderly or disabled members. A man might spend 50 years bending over a workbench, but he'd die with a roof overhead and his trade remembered. But for those who succeeded, the rewards were tangible. A master could open his own shop, hang out a sign, and stamp his goods with the guild mark, a symbol of quality and approval. He could attend meetings at the guild hall, vote on decisions, and participate in feasts, parades, and religious festivals organized by the guild. In many towns, guilds even had their own patron saints, altars in churches, and public processions. And it wasn't all ceremony. Guilds maintained strict rules. Prices had to be consistent, weights and measures honest, and materials pure. In this way, the guild functioned like a protective shell around the artisan, providing a form of legal and social security. But guilds weren't open to everyone. Women were rarely allowed as full members, though in some trades, especially textiles, brewing, or embroidery, widows could inherit their husband's business and continue under the guild's protection. Foreigners, too, faced resistance. A German shoemaker settling in a French town might be excluded or charged extra fees. And then there was the matter of rising within the guild. Not all masters were equal. Within each guild, there was a hierarchy. Junior members, senior members, and guild elders or wardens who oversaw administration. But with power came politics. Guilds sometimes clashed with merchant elites, the church, or even royalty. Kings might bypass guild rules to award monopolies. Nobles might pressure guilds to supply goods on credit. Inside the guilds, rivalries brewed, and beneath it all, the ordinary craftsman worked planing boards, stitching seams, hammering iron cot. Between pride in his trade and frustration with its politics, still, the guild offered one thing he could get nowhere else: protection. If his shop was robbed or burned, the guild might help. And the guild left marks everywhere. Walk through a medieval city, and you'll find guild crests carved into doorlets, painted onto shop signs, stamped into pewter cups, woven into wall hangings, and etched onto tools. The guild even followed craftsmen into death. Many guilds had burial societies, ensuring members were laid to rest with dignity. Still, as we sit in the corner of that guild hall, listening to the quiet debate over a new apprentice's admission, we're left to wonder, did the guild exist to serve the craftsman, or had the craftsman come to serve the guild? Let's finish this story, not in the guild, but in the places where the craftsman's legacy still echoes: cathedrals, thresholds, footpaths, tavern beams, and crypts. Because while few craftsmen were remembered by name, their work remains scattered across the medieval landscape, woven into the everyday, hidden in plain sight. Let's begin at the foot of the door. Cobblers stitched new soles, patched holes, reinforced heels, and mended buckles. They kept boots marching, sandals walking, and children from going barefoot through snow. His legacy was worn into mud, leather, and mild. Here lies the work of the cobbler, the shoemaker, not to be confused with the who made new shoes from fresh leather, while the cobbler repaired what others had worn thin. And yet, for the peasant who only owned one pair of shoes, a good cobbler could mean the difference between comfort and infection. They chiseled arches, capitals, corbels, and fonts. Some worked under famous architects, carving Gothic cathedrals that soared into heaven. There were quiet expressions of identity, humor, defiance, and craft. A grandfather might lay the foundation. His grandson might set the last stone in the spire. And yet, even knowing they wouldn't see the end, they worked with care, measuring angles, setting joints, and mixing lime with water and ash. They might carve a lion, a wheat sheaf, or a fox curled under a vine. Some carved initial stinny signatures, meant to last beyond memory. Others carved misericords as secret supports under folding seats in choir, stalls decorated with satirical scenes, monkeys in robes, men drinking from boots, and bishops chased by devils. Artists and artisans were not always separated. Some painters, goldsmiths, or metalworkers did begin to inscribe their initials, especially in the Renaissance. But for most of the Middle Ages, humility was expected. The work belonged to God, the guild, or the Lord never. Others worked quietly in local parish churches, carving angels whose wings eroded slowly in the damp centuries. Shoes were expensive, passed down, reshaped, and rehealed. Some towns had a single cobbler serving dozens of families. A weather vane, shaped like a rooster, still spinning above a chapel centuries later. A technique perfected in 1270 might still be used in 1520. A tool shaped by a blacksmith in one century might be handed to his grandson in the next. Knowledge wasn't stored in books, it was stored in hands, muscle memory, and the friction of repetition. Every crown sat atop a cushion sewn by a weaver. Every window in every chapel gleamed because someone, long forgotten, mixed sand, ash, and mineral Zan blue glass with their breath. The craftsman's touch outlived the craftsman's breath. In York Minster, behind the scenes, stones are etched with initials. These weren't legacies meant to last, and yet they did. Found centuries later, they tell us not of kings or saints, but of Thomas the Cooper, who made barrels in 1423 and left his mark in the beam of a tavern attic. In old timber buildings, beam ends bear tiny carved circles or triangle symbols of the carpenter who laid them. In medieval bells, blacksmiths occasionally etched a signature into the clapper or rim, visible only to those who hung them. There you might find the carver's marker face, a leaf, a spiraling vine, or a tiny creature tucked just out of view. These were the details that no one commissioned, but everyone noticed. and others, they worked in alleys or beside stables, hunching over a bench with a curved needle and a block of wax thread. It was quiet work, repetitive. Stitch, stretch, punch, repeat. The cobbler didn't build monuments, but his work kept people moving. They built the world quietly, not for praise, but because someone had to do it, and they knew how. Now look up into the stonework of a church column or the curling edge of a wooden roof beam. Stone carvers shaped more than statues. Wood carvers, too, left their touch on everyday life on pew ends, bed frames, chests, and doorways. These carvings were not accidents. Many masons and carpenters never saw the completion of the buildings they helped raise. Cathedrals could take generations to finish because they understood something modern builders sometimes forget. What is made slowly tends to last, and yet the medieval craftsman rarely signed his name. Even so, there were exceptions. In the floor of the Basilica of St. Denis, one can find masons mark simple, geometric carvings meant to track labor. In towns, some craftsmen left graffiti names scratched into cellar walls, prices tallied in charcoal, and doodles on the backs of panels. Legacy was also passed through objects. A knife handed down through 5 generations. A carved chest passed from mother to daughter. In this way, artisans achieved a kind of immortality without glory, and they trained others to do the same. Apprentices became journeymen. Journeymen became masters. Masters took on apprentices, and the rhythm continued. There is something deeply human in this something that resists the tides of time. We talk often of medieval lords, saints, and warriors, but every altar was carried by a carpenter. So tonight, as you lie still, and the soft weight of the day begins to fade, consider this. If your name is never remembered, but your work endures in quiet corners and carved beams, is that not also a legacy? Tonight, as you ease into stillness and prepare to rest, we turn to a subject that medieval villagers knew intimately, but spoke of with quiet reverence. Not the dramatic battlefield deaths of kings or the executions in public squares, but the quiet, common, often painful dying of ordinary people. At home, surrounded by family, behind mud-plastered walls and smoky rafters. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, though that number is skewed by high infant mortality. Still, disease, famine, childbirth, and injury meant that few people reached old age, and everyone had seen someone die. A sibling, a parent, a child, or a neighbor. Death was not hidden away in hospitals. As part of the home, the village, and the seasonal rhythm of life. To live in a medieval village was to live in constant proximity to the end. Let's begin with what happened when a person began to decline. God was near. The soul would not wander untended into the next world. The church was there. There were no doctors in most villages, and even if there had been, medicine offered little help for serious illness. Family gathered. Candles were lit. Psalms were whispered. Sometimes neighbors came to hold vigil, sitting through the night in silence, or a soft song. If death came peacefully, it was met with weeping, but also with acceptance. No makeup. This let others know who had passed and that a burial was coming. The body, now laid in a wooden box or carried on a bier, was brought to the altar. The body was lowered. A handful of dirt might be scattered. There, the final rites were read. From dust you came, and to dust you shall return. The community departed quietly, slowly, back to chores, to livestock, to hungry mouths, to life. But for now, we rest in the common, familiar death of a villager dying in a wooden bed, in a single-room cottage, beneath a roof that leaked, but surrounded by love, prayer, and the ancient rhythm of the church. Sometimes, coins or tokens were placed in the hand of the data leftover echo of pagan customs or a gift for safe passage. The priest read prayers of commendation. The mass might be accompanied by a modest choir or simply by the murmured responses of those in attendance. Villagers might pause in their work to say a prayer or cross themselves. Life continued, but with a slight Hushan awareness that another soul had left their midst. The souls of the dead were believed to linger, to suffer in purgatory unless prayed for. Masas were purchased, candles lit, and alms given to the poor in their name. To be remembered was to be assisted in the next life. It was a return, a going home. No preservatives. Those who were excommunicated, those who took their own lives. Death smelled like the earth, and that smell was familiar. If it came suddenly or violently, confusion and fear followed. Either way, the body remained at home, often for a full day or more. He walked the same paths he always did, through fields, past fences, over footbridges, bringing with him a satchel of holy oils, a crucifix, and perhaps a small vial of consecrated wine, and dressed the deceased in a shroud, often plain linen, sometimes with small crosses stitched into the fabric. In poorer homes, the same cloth might be used again and again, laundered between uses. If the family could afford it, wax candles were placed at the head and feet, burning through the night. The gravedigger, usually hired by the parish or the manor, would dig a shallow plot in the churchyard, often beside other relatives. Graves were simple. In many cases, there was no headstone, just a wooden marker, a carved cross, or a pile of stones. Wealthier families might commission stone markers or small effigies, but most could not afford such memorials. These presents meant that the dying soul could receive the last rites or ritual meant to cleanse sin, grant peace, and prepare the spirit for passage. Instead, families relied on observation, care, and prayer. The signs were familiar: a persistent fever, shallow breath, darkened fingertips, or weakness that did not pass. This sacred rite included the confession of sins, a final absolution, the anointing of the body with oil on the eyes, ears, lips, hands, and feet, and, if possible, the receiving of the Eucharist viaticum, food for the journey. Women were the primary caregivers, using herbs, poultices, prayers, and warmth. Elderly women might be called to watch over the dying those with experience in midwifery, often also became caretakers of the dying. The parish priest was summoned once it became clear that the end was near. The priest performed the sacrament of extreme unction, now called the anointing of the sick. This ritual brought comfort not only to the dying but to the family as well. It signaled that death, though feared, was not faced alone. After the priest's visit, the dying person was rarely left alone. The month's mind, a remembrance, might be held 30 days later, and anniversaries were noted. The preparation of the body was intimate and solemn. It was usually women, mothers, daughters, widows who washed the body with warm water, combed the hair. There was no embalming. Meanwhile, the parish bell tolled once for each year of life, or in a specific rhythm known by the villagers. If the family had land, the burial might happen quickly, especially in warmer months. Or the simple fact that death came among familiar things, where life had always been. The funeral mass was held in the village church. Afterward, the procession walked a short path to the grave. But the ritual didn't end there. And what of those who died suddenly, without sacraments? Their fates were different, and we'll explore them soon, because death, for the medieval villager, wasn't an intrusion. Still, one wonders in the quiet dark, was it the final prayer that brought peace? As we follow the journey of death in a medieval village, we move now from the dim, candlelit cottage to the open earth, where rituals and customs continued not just as spiritual duties, but as matters of economy, community, and memory. Because death, while deeply sacred, was also practical. There were bodies to bury, fees to be paid, tools to be sharpened, bells to be rung, and shrouds to be sewn. Wealthier households might use finer fabric with stitched crosses or initials. Poorer families might reuse a shroud or even fashion one from old sheets or woolen cloaks. In England, after the mid-1600s, a law required the dead to be buried in English wool only in order to boost the domestic wool trade. But in earlier medieval centuries, linen remained the norm. It was a call to the village. Prepare your soul and assist this one in departing. To a child fetching water at the well, it was a familiar rhythm, sometimes mourned, sometimes simply accepted. The sound of the bell was the first public marker of death, the beginning of a chain of activity that would ripple through the village in the hours and days to follow. Then came the death knell, rung once the person had passed. Its rhythm varied from village to village. Some parishes rang 9 times for a man, 6 for a woman, and 3 for a child. Some rang once for each year of the person's life. These were not expansive cemeteries, but modest plots enclosed by low stone walls or wooden fences. Instead, the shrouded body was carried on a bier, often by male relatives or fellow guild members, depending on the deceased's station. Earth was scattered onto the shroud. A few words might be spoken by family. A small wooden marker might be placed, if the family could afford it. A stone slab might follow, etched with initials or a brief phrase. Women generally did not participate in the carrying, but followed behind in quiet procession. In some areas, a custom called the soul scot required the best animal or item owned by the deceased to be given to the lord or parish. This could include a cow, a cloak, or a treasured tool, whatever was deemed most valuable. Though controversial, it was accepted in many communities as part of the cost of passing. The rich and prominent were buried closer to the church building, sometimes even within it. The poor and unknown were buried along the edges. The more masses, the more prayers, the faster the soul might pass through purgatory. Alms were also distributed, bread to the poor, pennies to beggars, and food at the wake. Some families planted herbs or flowers, rosemary for remembrance, rue for repentance, and daisies for innocence. On feast days, families visited the graves, tidied the space, and lit candles. The family returns home to a cottage that feels emptier than before, and somewhere in the dark, a candle flickers behind a shutter, lighting a soul's journey into the unseen. The dead was spoken of around fires, mentioned in prayers, and remembered in the pattern of the seasons. These acts were both charitable and strategic, a currency of mercy for the departed. Centuries later, still walk in the shadows of those unmarked graves. Over time, space ran out, and graves were reused. Bones were removed, stacked in ossuaries or charnel houses, and the earth made ready for another. In the spaces between mourning and memory, a quiet economy of death existed, one shaped by tradition, social status, and the slow rhythm of village life. Names were repeated. Traits were compared. He has his grandfather's voice, someone might say, or she walks like her aunt did. In this way, the dead lived not as ghosts, but as echoes in daily life. In wet months, their work was miserable Sudan soil, slippery roots, and frostbound clay. Tools were shared, and payment was modest. Still, there was respect in the task. They prepared the earth as reverently as others prepared the soul. Their graves were unmarked. Their names, if recorded at all, were spoken cautiously. We will return to them in the next section. In some traditions, coins were placed over the eyes or in the hands, not as fare for the afterlife, necessarily, but as tokens of memory. A crucifix or rosary beads might also be tucked under the wrappings. Psalms were sung or recited if not aloud. Then inwardly, the mourners followed in their best clothing. Children watched from doorway. Chickens scattered as the bier passed. Dogs barked. Some villagers crossed themselves. Some whispered prayers. Others merely paused, tools in hand, before returning to work. Let's begin with the shroud. It offered a tangible task amid grief, a way for neighbors and relatives to participate in farewell. And for women especially, it was one of the last acts of service they could provide. Bathing, combing, anointing, and binding the body of a parent, spouse, or child. Shrouds were often simple linen cloths, sometimes bleached, sometimes unbleached, depending on the family's means. The body was typically laid out on a wooden board or bier, wrapped head to toe, and tied at the ankles and chinned with cloth strips to hold the mouth closed. This care wasn't just ceremonial, it was communal. The act of wrapping and preparing the dead bound the living together. Now we turn to the bell. The passing bell was rung as someone lay dying. Its toll signaled the need for prayers. These sounds echoed across fields and forests to a plowman at the edge of a distant pasture. The death knell told him someone in his world was gone. Bell ringers were paid, often in loaves of bread, coins, or jugs of ale. It was a humble but vital role. The next phase was burial. In most parishes, the churchyard served as the final resting place for villagers. Gravediggers were usually hired laborers, or sometimes volunteers from the community. Coffins, especially in rural villages, were rare. Most were reserved for the wealthy or the clergy. Funeral processions were solemn, slow, and public. The priest led with incense and holy water. Once at the gravesite, the rite of burial was performed. Prayers for the soul, a sprinkling of holy water, and the sign of the cross. And then, just as it had gathered, the crowd dispersed. But the work of the dead was not yet done. The family owed certain fees to the church, for the burial mass, to the gravedigger, and to the bell ringer. These were known as mortuary dues. Those who could afford it would also pay for additional masses to be said on behalf of the soul, and the memory did not fade quickly. A simple carved cross might be placed at the head of the grave. Children grew up hearing stories of relatives buried in the churchyard, and yet not all were buried with such care. Strangers, criminals, the unshriven, and those who died by suicide were sometimes buried outside consecrated ground at crossroads, in forests, or on the margins of fields. But here, for the moment, in this quiet village churchyard, we pause. Another life has been laid to rest. The bells are still, the tools are put away, and we ask, in this moment of stillness, if a person is measured not by what they owned, but by how many came to carry them, cry for them, or remember them. How many of us, now that we've walked through the gentle passing of an ordinary villager, let's open the churchyard gate a little wider. Let's wander beyond the neat rows of shrouds and crosses, out to the edges of the sacred ground where time has eroded memory and the dirt remembers what people do not. Sometimes there were too many dead for the living to grieve properly. And when that happened, the system stretched, then bent, then quietly adapted. Because medieval death didn't always come gently. Sometimes it came in waves, overwhelming the rituals, the churchyards, and the parish bells. Burial plots weren't owned forever. They were reused, often within a generation, after a body had decayed, typically over 10 to 15 years in temperate soil stuff. Bones might be dug up to make room for another. This wasn't considered disrespectful. The soul had already moved on. The bones were relocated to ossuaries, small houses of bone kept beneath churches or in special chapels. Let's begin with the graveyard itself. The remains of dozens, even hundreds, of villagers might be kept in a single stone room, marked with a cross and a prayer. These bones were not named, but they were not forgotten. The church continued to pray for all the souls they represented. Medieval graveyards weren't designed for permanence. Most had limited space, especially in small parishes. These were deep, wide trenches, sometimes hastily blessed by a priest, sometimes not into which dozens of bodies were lowered. In cities like London or Florence, entire neighborhoods vanished within weeks. Cartloads of the dead rolled down cobbled streets. The cries of grief were replaced by the silence of exhaustion. Special masses were said for the unnamed. Monks wrote registers of the dead, even if no family remained to claim them. And survivors, though, to who kept fragments of memory in prayer and song. Shrouds were minimal. Prayers were rushed or skipped. In some cases, bodies were piled with lime to accelerate decomposition. The dead were often buried in makeshift plots, far from home. Soldiers might be dumped into shallow pits, looted of their belongings, and left on. Civilians caught in the crossfire fared no better, and others Earth was shoveled as fast as possible before the stench became unbearable. In many parts of Europe, bone pits known as charnel pits were common. Skulls were stacked, femurs were sorted, and one half of the population. No village was untouched. No bell rang long enough. Children played around them. Flowers grew among them. The dead were not hidden. They were woven into village life. There weren't enough priests to offer the last rites, but they could walk the graveyard path and know, from the shape of the stones or the curve of the hedge, who lay where. These souls, they believed, wandered. Some were said to cause illness, or to appear in dreams, or to trouble animals. Stories were told of crossroads, burials, of weighted coffins, and of iron scissors placed on the chest to stop the soul from rising. They could tell you, that's where old Tom rests. The thatcher's son died in the hard winter. It was a way to keep the living world safe from the echoes of the dead. Or, here's the midwife who delivered my sister May, she rest easy. Most left no disturbance. Only a soft fading, a name spoken less and less. The gravedigger walks home, his boots muddy, and somewhere, in the warm hearth light of a cottage, a mother tells a child, that stone there that was your great-grandfather. He made shoes. He had a kind voice, a patch of earth, slowly blending back into pasture, a stone worn smooth by centuries of wind and moss. May be the quietest and most enduring monument of all. There weren't enough gravediggers, coffins, or candles, and yet memory faded. Once a grave was reused, the wooden marker might be lost, or the family might die out or move away. The new burial would take its place, and the old name would vanish. This rotation of death was not seen as coldest, was practical, expected, and part of the cycle. In fact, the very earth of the graveyard came to represent centuries of unnamed lives, stacked gently upon one another. But then came moments that shattered this rhythm. Plague, war, and famine. The most infamous of these was, of course, the Black Death. In 1347, the plague arrived in Europe. Within 2 years, it had killed between 1/3 when death came this fast. The rituals broke down. Villages dug mass graves, known later as plague pits. Sometimes, family members were buried together. Sometimes they weren't. Still, even then, the church tried to keep memory alive. Where possible, plague pits were marked, sometimes with stone crosses, sometimes with fences or carved memorials. Other times, it wasn't disease but war that disrupted burial. When armies passed through villages, fields became battlefields, and graveyards became afterthoughts. And yet, through it all, ordinary people continued to remember. They remembered with candles lit in windows on feast days, especially All Souls' Day on November 2nd, when the dead were honored with prayers, alms, and visits to the graveyard. They remembered with storytelling passing on the names of relatives, telling children where to kneel and whose grave to tidy. They remembered with mossy stones and herbs planted at the foot of graves, with tokens left behind, buttons, rosaries, and carved wooden hearts. And sometimes they remembered in silence. Because memory, in medieval times, didn't rely on writing. Most villagers were illiterate. Even forgotten graves were part of the landscape. And then there were the ghosts. Not in the theatrical sense, but in the quiet way villagers sometimes spoke of unrested souls. Those who died These weren't superstitions to the villagers, they were beliefs rooted in tradition, fear, and reverence. The proper burial wasn't just a social ritual, but most deaths were not so haunting. And so we return, finally, to the heart of the village too, the churchyard gate, to the well-worn path, to the graves both marked and in the fading light. We can still hear the last notes of the passing bell. The tools are put away, and maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Because while names may vanish, and shrouds may rot, and bells may fall silent, the fact that someone lived, died, and was remembered by even one other soul